In the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, where justice was as harsh as the desert wind, dawn brought more than just another day. It brought a reckoning that would test the very soul of a community. When the sun's first rays touched the wooden gallows in the town square, nobody expected that before the rope could claim its intended victim, a love so fierce would emerge that it would defy death itself. This is not just a story of crime and punishment. This is the story of Sarah McKenna, a woman branded as a killer, and James Iron Patterson, a warrior whose heart proved stronger than his reputation. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, sacrifice, and the lengths one person will go to save another. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with guns or fists, they're fought with words that can either condemn or set free. This is their story. This is what happened when dawn broke over Cedar Ridge on that fateful morning in 1887. The morning mist clung to the wooden buildings of Cedar Ridge like a shroud, as if nature itself was mourning what was about to happen. Sarah McKenna sat in her cold cell, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the small window where the first hint of dawn was beginning to show. She had stopped crying 3 days ago. There were no tears left. Marshal Tom Bradley walked past her cell for the 5th time that morning, his boots echoing against the stone floor. He was a good man, Sarah knew that much. But good men sometimes had to do terrible things when the law demanded it. The whole town had demanded it, actually. They wanted justice for what happened to old Henry Morrison, and Sarah McKenna was the only one left to pay for it. "Time, Sarah," Marshal Bradley said softly, stopping in front of her cell. His weathered face showed none of the satisfaction that some men might feel at this moment. Instead, there was something that looked almost like regret. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk steady. She had promised herself she would face this with dignity, even if she was innocent. Even if nobody believed her story about what really happened that night 3 months ago. The cell door opened with a rusty creak. Sarah stepped out and followed the marshal down the narrow hallway. Behind her, she could hear Deputy Collins clearing his throat nervously. Poor Collins had never seen an execution before. He was barely 22 and still believed that good always won in the end. Outside, the town square was already filling with people. Sarah had lived in Cedar Ridge for 5 years, and she recognized most of the faces. There was Mrs. Henderson from the general store, looking stern and righteous. There was Jake Miller, who ran the saloon, shaking his head sadly. There were the Murphy children, who their mother should have kept at home instead of bringing them to watch a woman die. The gallows stood in the center of the square like a wooden monument to frontier justice. It had been built quickly after the circuit judge had passed sentence on Sarah. The whole town had contributed wood and nails and labor. They wanted to make sure justice was served properly. Sarah walked toward the platform with her head held high. She wore her best dress, the blue one with small white flowers that her mother had sent her from back east. If she was going to die today, she wanted to look like the lady her mother had raised her to be. Marshal Bradley helped her up the wooden steps. Her hands were tied behind her back, but he was gentle about it. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I truly am." "I know," she whispered back. "You're just doing your job." The crowd had grown larger. Sarah estimated there were maybe 200 people gathered in the square. Some had come from neighboring towns just to witness the execution. Word had spread far and wide about the schoolteacher who had allegedly murdered Henry Morrison in cold blood. Reverend Matthews stepped forward with his Bible. He was supposed to give Sarah a chance to confess her sins and make peace with God. But Sarah had nothing to confess except the sin of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Sarah McKenna," Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying across the quiet square. "Do you have any last words before you meet your Maker?" So many familiar faces, so many people who had smiled at her in the past, who had trusted her with their children's education, who had invited her to church suppers and community gatherings. Now they were here to watch her die. "I am innocent," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I did not kill Henry Morrison. I was trying to help him when I found him dying in his cabin. But I understand why you don't believe me. Sometimes the truth is harder to accept than a simple story with a clear villain." She paused, looking around the crowd one more time. "I forgive all of you for this. I hope someday you'll learn what really happened that night." The crowd murmured. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others just looked angry that she was still claiming innocence even now. Marshal Bradley stepped forward with the noose. His hands were shaking slightly. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think of something peaceful. She thought about her childhood home in Pennsylvania, about her mother's garden full of roses, about the sound of children laughing during recess at the schoolhouse. "Wait!" The voice came from the back of the crowd. loud and commanding. Everyone turned to look. Sarah opened her eyes and saw a man pushing through the gathered townspeople. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a beard. Sarah recognized him immediately. James Patterson, though everyone called him Iron on account of his reputation as the toughest man in 3 counties, Iron Patterson was a legend in these parts. He had been a soldier in the war, then a railroad worker, then a man who hired himself out to solve problems that other men couldn't handle. He had cleaned up towns, tracked down outlaws, and once reportedly fought off 6 men single-handed to protect a woman and her children from bandits. But what was he doing here? Sarah had never spoken more than a few words to the man in all the time she had lived in Cedar Ridge. Iron pushed his way to the front of the crowd. Marshal Bradley held up his hand. "Hold on there, Patterson. We're conducting legal business here." "Legal, maybe," Iron said, his voice carrying across the square. "But not just." The crowd began to buzz with excitement. This was better than they had hoped for. Not only were they getting an execution, but now Iron Patterson was getting involved. "Sarah McKenna didn't kill Henry Morrison," Iron announced, looking directly at Marshal Bradley. "I know who did, and I can prove it." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. Was this really happening? Was someone finally going to tell the truth? Marshal Bradley frowned. "Patterson, if you had evidence, you should have brought it forward during the trial." "I didn't have proof then," Iron replied. "I do now." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I found this yesterday, buried behind Morrison's cabin. It's got Morrison's blood on it, and it belongs to the real killer." The crowd pressed forward, trying to see what was in the pouch. Marshal Bradley looked uncertain. "Even if that's true, Patterson, the law has run its course. The judge has spoken. The sentence has been passed." Iron's eyes flashed with anger. "The law is supposed to serve justice, Marshal, not execute innocent women." "You can't know for certain she's innocent," called out someone from the crowd. "Maybe she had help. Maybe they were in it together." Iron turned to face the crowd. "You people know me. You know I don't lie. You know I don't make claims I can't back up. Sarah McKenna is innocent. I'll stake my life on it." "Then do it," shouted Jake Miller from the saloon. "If you're so sure she's innocent, why don't you trade places with her?" The crowd roared its approval. This was exactly the kind of dramatic turn they had come hoping to see. Iron was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see him thinking, weighing his options. Finally, he looked up at her standing on the gallows platform. "I'll do it," he said simply. The crowd fell silent. Even Marshal Bradley looked stunned. "I'll do it," Iron repeated, louder this time. "Hang me instead of her, but give me one day to prove her innocence. If I can't produce the real killer by tomorrow morning, you can hang us both." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Why would this man, who barely knew her, risk his life for her? Marshal Bradley shook his head. "That's not how the law works, Patterson." "Sometimes the law needs help working right," Iron replied. He walked closer to the gallows. "What's it going to hurt? If I can't prove she's innocent, you'll have 2 executions instead of 1. If I can prove it, then justice will truly be served." The crowd was divided. Some people were shouting that they wanted to see Sarah hang now, as planned. Others were curious about Iron's evidence. A few were beginning to wonder if maybe they had been wrong about Sarah all along. Reverend Matthews stepped forward. "Perhaps we should consider Mr. Foe, Patterson's proposal. If there is even a chance that an innocent woman might die today, don't we owe it to God and our consciences to be absolutely certain?" "She had a fair trial," protested Mrs. Oden. "Henderson, a jury found her guilty. A jury that heard only part of the story," Iron shot back. "A jury that convicted her because she was found with Morrison's body and couldn't prove where she'd been that evening."
Sarah remembered that awful night 3 months ago.
She had gone to check on Henry Morrison because he hadn't been seen in town for several days. She had found him in his cabin, barely alive, with a knife wound in his chest. She had tried to help him, but he had died in her arms before she could get him to the doctor. When people had arrived and found her covered in Morrison's blood, it had looked bad. Very bad. And when she couldn't explain exactly why she had gone to his cabin alone that evening, people had started to assume the worst. The truth was, she had gone because Morrison had sent her a note asking her to come. But the note had disappeared, and without it, her story sounded like a lie. Marshal Bradley looked around at the crowd, then up at Sarah, then at Iron Patterson. "This is highly irregular." "So is executing an innocent woman," Iron replied. The marshal was quiet for a long time. Finally, he sighed. One day. You have until dawn tomorrow. But if you can't produce convincing proof of her innocence, both of you will hang." The crowd exploded with excitement and argument. Some people were angry that the execution had been postponed. Others were intrigued by the possibility of a double execution tomorrow. A few were beginning to whisper that maybe they should give Ian Patterson a chance. Ian climbed up onto the gallows platform. "Thank you, Marshal." Marshal Bradley began to untie Sarah's hands. "Don't thank me yet. You may have just signed your own death warrant." Ian looked at Sarah directly for the first time since he had arrived. His eyes were dark brown, and she could see determination in them, but also something else. Something that looked almost like care. "Why?" she whispered to him as Marshal Bradley helped her down from the platform. Ian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I know you're innocent. And because sometimes a man has to take a stand for what's right, even if it costs him everything." As the crowd began to disperse, arguing among themselves about what had just happened, Sarah realized that her life had just taken a turn she never could have expected. She was no longer facing certain death in the next few minutes, but now James Iron Patterson was risking his life for hers. She had 24 hours to live, but more importantly, Ian Patterson had 24 hours to prove her innocence, or they would both die tomorrow at dawn. Marshal Bradley escorted Sarah back to her cell, but this time the walk felt different. There was hope now, mixed with the fear. And there was something else, something she had never felt before, toward the stern, quiet man who had just volunteered to die for her. As the cell door closed behind her, Sarah could hear Ian outside talking with Marshal Bradley about where to begin his investigation. His voice was calm and determined. He spoke like a man who had no doubt he would succeed. Sarah sat down on her narrow cot and finally allowed herself to cry again. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude toward a man who barely knew her but had been willing to stake his life on her innocence. Outside her cell window, she could see people still gathered in small groups in the town square, talking excitedly about what had happened. Tomorrow morning would bring either vindication or double tragedy. But for the first time in 3 months, Sarah McKenna dared to hope that justice might actually be served in Cedar Ridge. The question now was, could Ian Patterson find the real killer in just 24 hours? And if he could, would the town accept the truth, or would they find a way to hang them both anyway? As afternoon turned toward evening, Sarah could hear Ian's voice outside, asking questions, following leads, searching for the truth that she knew was out there somewhere. She closed her eyes and prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life. Not just for her own salvation, but for the brave man who had chosen to stand between her and death. Ian Patterson had been awake for 36 straight hours, but sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when Sarah McKenna's life depended on what he could discover before dawn, not when his own life was now hanging in the balance alongside hers. He stood in Henry Morrison's abandoned cabin, holding a lantern high as he examined every inch of the small space where the old man had died 3 months ago. The local sheriff and his deputies had searched this place after Morrison's death, but Ian had learned long ago that most lawmen looked for evidence that supported what they already believed, rather than evidence that might prove them wrong. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, and something else that Ian couldn't quite identify. Death, maybe. Or just the emptiness that settles into a place after its owner is gone. Morrison's few possessions were still scattered around the single room. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, some cooking pots, and shelves lined with books. Henry Morrison had been an educated man, which was unusual for someone living alone in the frontier wilderness. Ian had known Morrison, though not well. The old man had kept to himself mostly, coming into town maybe once a month for supplies. He paid his bills, minded his own business, and never caused trouble for anyone, which made his murder even more puzzling. Who would want to kill a harmless old hermit? According to the trial testimony, Sarah had claimed she found Morrison still alive when she arrived at the cabin. She said he had tried to tell her something before he died, but she couldn't make out his words. The prosecution had argued that she was lying, that she had killed Morrison and then pretended to find him dying to cover her crime. But Ian believed Sarah's story. He had watched her during the trial, had seen the genuine grief and confusion in her eyes when she testified. That wasn't the look of a killer trying to cover her tracks. That was the look of someone who had witnessed something terrible and couldn't understand why it had happened. Ian knelt beside the bed where Morrison had been found. The bloodstains were still visible on the wooden floor, dark brown now after 3 months. He studied the pattern of the stains carefully. Blood told stories if he knew how to read it. What he saw didn't match the prosecution's version of events. If Morrison had been killed in his bed, as they claimed, the blood would have pooled differently. Instead, the pattern suggested Morrison had been wounded somewhere else in the cabin and had crawled or been dragged to the bed. Iron followed the faint blood trail across the room to the door. Morrison had been attacked near the entrance to his cabin, then had either crawled or been carried to his bed. That meant the killer had spent time in this room after the attack. But why? Iron examined the door more carefully. There were scratches in the wood around the lock, fresh scratches that hadn't been there long. Someone had forced this lock recently, and probably more than once. He thought about the leather pouch he had shown the crowd that morning. He had lied about finding it yesterday. He had actually found it 2 weeks ago, hidden in a hollow tree about 100 yards from Morrison's cabin. Inside the pouch had been a bloody knife and a letter that changed everything about Morrison's death. But Iron hadn't been able to act on that evidence until now. The letter was signed by someone he knew, someone who had connections and influence in Cedar Ridge. Someone who could have made Iron's life very difficult if he had tried to expose the truth before Sarah's execution. Iron had spent those 2 weeks carefully investigating, gathering more evidence, building a case that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. Because once he revealed what he knew, there would be powerful people in town who wanted to silence him permanently. The killer was someone who had been stealing from Henry Morrison for months, maybe years. Morrison had discovered the thefts and had threatened to expose the thief. The letter in the pouch was Morrison's attempt to blackmail his attacker into returning the stolen items and leaving town. But blackmail was a dangerous game, especially when the target had too much to lose. Iron heard footsteps outside the cabin. He blew out his lantern and moved quietly to the window. 3 men were approaching the cabin, and Iron recognized them immediately. Deputy Collins, Jake Miller from the saloon, and Tom Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's son who worked as a clerk at the bank. He's got to be in there, Iron heard Miller say. This is the 3rd place we've looked. What if he finds something? Collins asked nervously. He won't find anything we haven't already taken care of, Henderson replied. And if he does, well, accidents happen. Especially to men who go poking around in dangerous places at night. Iron smiled grimly. So they were trying to stop his investigation. That meant he was getting close to something they didn't want him to find. He waited until the 3 men entered the cabin, then stepped out from behind the door with his gun drawn. Evening, boys. Nice night for a walk. Collins jumped and nearly dropped his lantern. Miller cursed and reached for his gun, but stopped when he saw Iron already had him covered. Henderson just stood there looking calm, as if he had expected this. Iron, Henderson said pleasantly. What brings you out here so late? Same thing that brings you, I expect, Iron replied, looking for evidence about Morrison's death. Evidence? Miller laughed nervously. There's no evidence here. This place was searched months ago, by men who weren't looking for the right things, Iron said. He studied the 3 men carefully. Collins looked scared and guilty. Miller looked angry and defensive. Henderson looked calculating, like he was trying to figure out how much Iron knew and how much trouble he might cause. You boys know something about Morrison's death that didn't come out at the trial, Iron continued. Want to tell me about it, or should I just keep digging on my own? You're wasting your time, Henderson said. Sarah McKenna killed Morrison. Everyone knows it. The jury decided it. Justice will be done tomorrow morning. Will it? Iron asked. Or will an innocent woman die while the real killer walks free? Collins shifted nervously. Iron, maybe we should just go back to town. Let the law handle this. The law already handled it, Miller snapped. McKenna was tried and convicted fair and square. Iron holstered his gun and picked up his lantern. You boys can go. But I'm staying here until I find what I'm looking for. After the 3 men left, Iron resumed his search. He was more convinced than ever that they knew something about Morrison's death. The question was whether they were covering for the killer or whether one of them was the killer. He spent the next 2 hours going through every item in the cabin. Morrison's books were particularly interesting. The old man had been well read, with volumes on literature, history, and science. But hidden inside one of the books, Iron found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a bank deposit slip, dated just 2 days before Morrison's death. According to the slip, Morrison had deposited nearly $3,000 into his account at the Cedar Ridge Bank. That was more money than most people in town saw in 5 years. Where had a hermit like Morrison gotten that kind of cash? Iron folded the deposit slip carefully and put it in his pocket. This was the piece of evidence he had been looking for, the thing that would tie everything together. But first, he needed to pay a visit to someone who might have more answers. Someone who had been conspicuously absent from Morrison's funeral and who had been asking a lot of questions about when Sarah would be executed. Ian left the cabin and rode back toward town. It was nearly midnight now, and most of Cedar Ridge was dark and quiet. But there was one building with lights still burning, the Cedar Ridge Bank. Ian tied his horse to the hitching post and walked around to the back of the building. The rear door was open, and he could hear voices inside. He moved closer and peered through the window. Tom Henderson was inside with two other men Ian didn't recognize. They were going through papers and files, clearly looking for something specific. It has to be here somewhere, Henderson was saying. Morrison wouldn't have kept the original at his cabin. What if he gave it to someone else? One of the other men asked. He didn't have anyone else, Henderson replied. The old fool lived like a hermit. He wouldn't have trusted anyone with this. Ian smiled. They were looking for the same thing he was. Proof of what Morrison had discovered and why he had been killed. He waited until the three men left through the front door, then slipped in through the back. The bank safe was open, and papers were scattered across Henderson's desk. Ian gathered up the papers and began reading by lamplight. What he found confirmed everything he had suspected and more. Tom Henderson had been systematically stealing from the bank for over 2 years, skimming money from accounts and falsifying records. Henry Morrison, who had been one of the bank's largest depositors, had discovered the thefts when he came to make a large withdrawal. Instead of going to the authorities immediately, Morrison had decided to confront Henderson privately. He had demanded that Henderson return all the stolen money and resign from his position, or Morrison would expose him to the Marshal and the bank's board of directors. Henderson had agreed to Morrison's terms, but instead of returning the money, he had decided to solve his problem permanently. He had gone to Morrison's cabin on the night of the murder, ostensibly to deliver the returned funds. Instead, he had attacked Morrison with a knife. But Morrison hadn't died immediately. He had managed to write a letter describing Henderson's crimes and had hidden it in his cabin before Henderson could find it. When Henderson realized Morrison might have left evidence behind, he had returned to search the cabin multiple times over the following weeks. Ian gathered up all the papers that documented Henderson's embezzlement. This was evidence that would not only prove Sarah's innocence, but would also convict the real killer. But as he prepared to leave the bank, Ian heard footsteps outside. Through the front window, he could see Henderson returning with Marshal Bradley and several other men. Ian quickly stuffed the papers into his coat and looked for another way out. But the back door had been locked from the outside, and the only windows were too small to climb through. He was trapped. I tell you, Marshal, I saw a light in here, Henderson was saying as they approached the front door. Someone's been going through the bank's private records. Ian heard keys jingling and the sound of the front door being unlocked. In seconds, they would discover him inside the bank with evidence of Henderson's crimes. And Henderson would claim that Ian was the one trying to steal from the bank. Ian made a quick decision. Instead of trying to hide, he walked calmly to the front door and opened it just as Henderson was about to enter. "Evening, Marshal," Ian said pleasantly. "Tom, gentlemen." Marshal Bradley looked confused. "Patterson? What are you doing in the bank?" "Waiting for Tom," Ian replied, looking directly at Henderson. "We need to have a talk about Henry Morrison's death." Henderson's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. "I don't know what you mean." "And you had no right to break into the bank." "I didn't break in," Ian said. "The back door was wide open. Almost like someone had been here recently, going through papers looking for something specific." "That's impossible," Henderson said. "I locked that door myself earlier this evening." Ian smiled. "Did you?" "That's interesting. Because I've been watching the bank for the past hour, and I saw you leaving through the back door with 2 other men just 20 minutes ago." Henderson realized his mistake too late. By claiming he had locked the door earlier, he had just admitted he had been at the bank recently. But if he had locked the door, how had Ian gotten inside? Marshal Bradley looked back and forth between Ian and Henderson. "What's this about, Patterson?" Ian reached into his coat and pulled out the bank records he had gathered. "It's about $3,000 that Henry Morrison deposited 2 days before he died. It's about systematic embezzlement from this bank over the past 2 years. And it's about Tom Henderson killing Morrison to keep his crimes secret." Henderson laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's ridiculous. You can't prove any of that." Ian handed the papers to Marshal Bradley. "These documents show a pattern of theft from customer accounts. Morrison discovered the thefts when he tried to make a large withdrawal. Henderson killed him to keep him quiet. Marshal Bradley began examining the papers by lamplight. His expression grew more serious as he read. "These are bank records, all right," the marshal said slowly, "and they seem to show irregularities in several accounts." "Those papers are stolen bank property," Henderson protested. "You can't use them as evidence." "Can't I?" Iron replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Morrison's deposit slip. Morrison made this deposit 2 days before he died. $3,000 in cash. Where does a hermit get that kind of money, Tom? Henderson was sweating now, despite the cool night air. How would I know? Maybe he had been saving for years. Iron shook his head. Morrison withdrew that money from his account 6 months ago. All of it. His account should have been empty. But somehow, 2 days before he died, he had $3,000 to deposit again, almost like someone had returned stolen money to him. Marshal Bradley was studying the documents more carefully now. These records do show Morrison's account being accessed multiple times over the past year. Small withdrawals, but frequent ones. Henderson was stealing from Morrison and other customers, Iron explained. Morrison found out and threatened to expose him. Henderson killed Morrison to keep him quiet, but not before Morrison forced him to return the stolen money. Henderson looked around at the other men, searching for support, but their expressions had changed. The doubt that had been in their faces when Iron first made his accusations was being replaced by suspicion. "This is all speculation," Henderson said desperately. "You have no proof that I killed Morrison." Iron reached into his other pocket and pulled out the leather pouch he had shown the crowd that morning. He opened it carefully and removed a bloody knife. "Morrison's blood," Iron said simply. "And your initials carved into the handle, Tom." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Henderson's sharp intake of breath. Marshal Bradley took the knife and examined it closely. Sure enough, carved into the wooden handle were the initials T.H. "Where did you get this?" the marshal asked. "Hidden near Morrison's cabin," Iron replied, along with a letter Morrison wrote before he died, describing Henderson's thefts and naming him as his attacker. Henderson made a sudden move towards his gun, but Iron was faster. In one smooth motion, Iron drew his weapon and had it aimed at Henderson's chest. "Don't," Iron said quietly. "You've caused enough trouble already." Marshal Bradley stepped forward and removed Henderson's gun from his holster. "Tom Henderson, you're under arrest for the murder of Henry Morrison." As Henderson was led away in handcuffs, Iron felt a profound sense of relief. It was nearly 3 a.m. now, but he had done what he promised. He had found the real killer and gathered the evidence to prove Sarah's innocence. But his work wasn't finished yet. He still had to convince the townspeople who had been so eager to see Sarah hanged that they had been wrong about her. He still had to make sure that justice was truly served. Iron walked through the quiet streets toward the jail where Sarah was being held. Marshal Bradley had gone ahead to release her from her cell and to prepare the paperwork that would officially clear her of all charges. As Iron approached the jail, he could see a light burning in the window of Sarah's cell. She was awake, probably unable to sleep, knowing that dawn would bring either freedom or death. Iron had saved her life tonight, but more than that, he had discovered something about himself in the process. Somewhere between volunteering to trade places with her on the gallows and spending the night hunting for her killer, Iron Patterson had realized that his feelings for Sarah McKenna went deeper than simple compassion for an innocent woman. He was in love with her, and tomorrow he was going to tell her so. The same crowd that had gathered to watch Sarah McKenna die was back in the town square at dawn, but this time their mood was completely different. Word had spread quickly through Cedar Ridge about Tom Henderson's arrest and the evidence that Iron Patterson had uncovered. Instead of bloodthirsty anticipation, there was now an uncomfortable mixture of shame, curiosity, and relief. Sarah stood beside Iron on the platform where she was supposed to have been hanged just 24 hours earlier. But instead of facing a noose, she was facing freedom and vindication. Marshal Bradley had officially dropped all charges against her at 4 a.m, and Henderson was now in the cell that Sarah had occupied for the past 3 months. "Folks," Marshal Bradley called out to the crowd, "I want to make sure everyone understands what happened here. Sarah McKenna is completely innocent of Henry Morrison's murder. The real killer was Tom Henderson, and we have conclusive proof of his guilt." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people looked relieved. Others looked embarrassed that they had been so eager to see an innocent woman executed. A few still looked skeptical, as if they couldn't quite believe that their trusted bank clerk had been a murderer and a thief. Henderson stood near the front of the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Her son's arrest had devastated her, but she had the dignity to step forward and speak. Sarah, she called out, her voice shaking. I owe you an apology. We all do. I was so certain you were guilty. I wanted to see you punished for what I thought you had done. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Sarah looked down at the older woman with compassion. Mrs. Henderson, you don't need to apologize. You believed what the evidence seemed to show. We all make mistakes when we're trying to understand terrible things. Ian watched Sarah as she spoke to the crowd with grace and forgiveness, even though these same people had been ready to cheer for her death yesterday. Her strength and dignity impressed him even more than her beauty had when he had first noticed her teaching school children in the town square months ago. Reverend Matthew stepped forward with his Bible. Perhaps we should take a moment to thank God that justice has been served and that an innocent life has been spared. The crowd bowed their heads as the Reverend led them in prayer. Ian found himself praying too, but not just for Sarah's deliverance. He was praying for courage to tell her what was in his heart. When the prayer ended, people began to approach Sarah to offer their apologies and congratulations. The Murphy children, whose mother had brought them to witness the execution, now ran up to hug their former schoolteacher. Mrs. Patterson from the general store pressed a basket of food into Sarah's hands. Jake Miller from the saloon invited her to dinner at his establishment. On the house, Ian stood back and watched as the town that had condemned Sarah now embraced her. It warmed his heart to see her receiving the respect and affection she deserved, but it also made him wonder if there would be room in her new life for a man like him. After most of the crowd had dispersed, Sarah walked over to where Ian was standing. They were alone now, except for Marshal Bradley, who was cleaning up the paperwork from Henderson's arrest. I don't know how to thank you, Sarah said quietly. You saved my life. You risked your own life for someone you barely knew. Ian looked into her eyes, those same green eyes he had been thinking about for months without ever having the courage to approach her. I knew you well enough, he said. I'd been watching you with the school children, listening to you read to them in the town square on Sunday afternoons. I could see what kind of person you were. When they accused you of murder, I knew it had to be wrong. Sarah blushed slightly. You were watching me. I wanted to talk to you, Ian admitted. But I figured a schoolteacher wouldn't have much interest in conversation with someone like me. I'm not educated like you are. I can't quote poetry or discuss books. Sarah smiled. James Patterson, you are one of the most intelligent men I've ever met. You solved a murder that had everyone else fooled. You saw evidence that trained lawmen missed. You understood people's motivations and followed clues that no one else even noticed. That's not the kind of intelligence you learn from books. Ian felt his heart racing. She had called him James instead of Ian. No one had called him by his real name in years. Sarah, he said, I need to tell you something. What I did yesterday, volunteering to take your place on the gallows, it wasn't just about justice. It was about... He stopped, struggling to find the words. How did a man who was more comfortable with guns and fists than with conversation tell a woman that he loved her? Sarah stepped closer to him. It was about what? It was about love, Ian said simply. I've been in love with you for months. I couldn't bear to watch you die for something you didn't do, and I couldn't bear to live in a world without you in it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Ian held his breath, waiting for her response. I wondered, she said finally, why you would risk everything for me. I hoped it might be something more than just compassion for an innocent person. And? Ian asked, his heart pounding. Sarah smiled, and it was like the sun coming up. And I'm glad it was. Because during these past 24 hours, watching you fight for my life, seeing your determination and your courage and your kindness, I realized that I've fallen in love with you too. Ian felt like he could breathe again for the first time since yesterday morning. He reached out and took Sarah's hands in his. I want to do this right, he said. I want to court you properly. Take you to church dinners and town dances. Let everyone see that James Patterson is trying to win the heart of Sarah McKenna. Sarah laughed and the sound was music to Ian's ears. I think you've already won it, she said. But I'd love to be courted properly anyway. Marshal Bradley cleared his throat behind them. Sorry to interrupt, but there are a few more details we need to sort out. Ian and Sarah turned to face the Marshal, still holding hands. Henderson is asking to see you, Sarah, Marshal Bradley said. He wants to apologize in person. You don't have to if you don't want to. Sarah considered this for a moment. I'll see him, she decided. But I'd like James to come with me. The three of them walked into the jail, where Tom Henderson sat in the cell that had been Sarah's home for 3 months. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled, and his face was haggard with exhaustion and guilt. "Sarah," he said when he saw her, "I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to be accused of Morrison's murder." "But you didn't mind letting me hang for it," Sarah replied quietly. Henderson hung his head. "I was scared. I knew I was going to prison for the embezzlement, but murder meant the gallows. I convinced myself that maybe it was better if one person died instead of both of us." "That wasn't your decision to make," Iron said sternly. "Sarah was innocent. You had no right to let her pay for your crimes." "I know," Henderson said. "I know, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life, however long that is." Marshal Bradley spoke up. "The circuit judge will be here next week. You'll have your trial then, Henderson." Henderson nodded. "I'll plead guilty. There's no point in dragging this out any longer. I just wanted Sarah to know that I'm sorry. That's not enough, I know, but it's all I have to offer." Sarah looked at the broken man in the cell. 3 days ago, she would have been filled with anger towards him. But now, having escaped death herself and finding love with Iron, she felt mostly pity. "I forgive you, Tom," she said. "What you did was wrong, and you'll have to face the consequences. But I forgive you." Henderson began to cry then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Sarah and Iron left him there with his guilt and his tears. Outside the jail, the morning sun was shining bright and warm. Sarah took Iron's arm as they walked toward the schoolhouse, where she would soon resume teaching Cedar Ridge's children. "What happens now?" she asked. Iron considered the question. "Now we figure out how to build a life together. I've got some money saved up from various jobs, enough to buy some land and maybe start a small ranch. But I'd want to stay close to town so you could keep teaching if you wanted to." "I do want to keep teaching," Sarah said. "I love those children. And after everything that's happened, I think this town needs to remember the importance of education and truth." They had reached the schoolhouse now. Sarah stood on the steps where she had said goodbye to her students 3 months ago, thinking she would never see them again. "There's something else I want to tell you," Iron said. Sarah turned to face him, curious. "My real name isn't Iron," he said. "I mean, everyone calls me Iron because of my reputation, but my given name is James Thomas Patterson. If we're going to be married, I want you to know who you're really marrying." "James Thomas Patterson," Sarah repeated, trying out the name. "I like it. It's a strong name. An honest name." "Married?" Iron asked, raising an eyebrow. "Did I ask you to marry me?" Sarah blushed. "Well, no, you didn't. But you said you wanted to court me properly, and I assumed..." Iron dropped to one knee right there on the schoolhouse steps. "Sarah McKenna," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "will you marry me?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard the sound of children's voices. Her students were arriving for the first day of school since her arrest. The children saw Iron on his knee and Sarah standing on the steps, and they began to clap and cheer. "Say yes, Miss McKenna," shouted little Tommy Murphy. "Say yes," echoed the other children. Sarah looked down at Iron, still kneeling on the wooden steps, still waiting for her answer. Then she looked at the children who had been part of her motivation to keep going during the darkest days of her imprisonment. "Yes," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, James Thomas Patterson, I will marry you." Iron stood up and kissed her right there in front of the schoolhouse, in front of the children, in front of anyone who happened to be walking by. It was a kiss that spoke of relief and love and hope for the future. When they broke apart, the children cheered even louder. Sarah laughed and wiped away tears of joy. "Now," she said to her students, "let's go inside and have some lessons. We have a lot of catching up to do." As the children filed into the schoolhouse, Iron lingered on the steps with Sarah. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Marrying someone like me won't be easy. People know my reputation. They know I've killed men in fights and lived by my gun. Some folks might not think I'm good enough for their schoolteacher." Sarah looked at him seriously. "James, yesterday you risked your life to save mine. You spent the night tracking down a killer and gathering evidence to prove my innocence. You showed more courage and honor and love than I've ever seen from any man. If people can't see what kind of man you really are, that's their problem, not ours." "I love you, Sarah McKenna. I love you too, James Patterson." 6 months later, James and Sarah Patterson stood in the same town square where Sarah had nearly been executed, but this time they were celebrating their wedding. The whole town had come to wish them well, including some visitors from neighboring communities who had heard the story of the schoolteacher who was saved from the gallows by love. Marshal Bradley performed the ceremony, since he was a justice of the peace as well as the town's lawman. Reverend Matthews gave the blessing. Even Mrs. Henderson, whose son was now serving 20 years in the territorial prison, came to offer her congratulations and best wishes. The couple had bought a small ranch just outside of town, close enough for Sarah to continue teaching, but far enough away to give them privacy and room to raise the family they hoped to have someday. Iron had given up his life as a hired gun and was now raising cattle and horses. As they danced together in the town square under the stars, Sarah thought about how close she had come to losing everything. If Iron hadn't stepped forward that morning on the gallows, she would be dead now. Instead, she was married to the man she loved, surrounded by friends and community, with a future bright with possibilities. "What are you thinking about?" Iron asked as they swayed to the music provided by a local fiddle player. "I'm thinking about that morning 6 months ago," Sarah replied. "About how you stormed through the crowd and demanded that they hang you instead of me." Iron spun her around, gently. "I couldn't let them hang an innocent woman, especially not the woman I was in love with." "How did you know for sure I was innocent?" Sarah asked. "You hadn't seen the evidence yet. You were just taking my word for it." Iron was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer. "I knew because I had been watching you for months before Morrison's death. I saw how you treated the children, how you helped elderly Mrs. Bean Thompson with the groceries, how you visited sick people even when there was no one to thank you for it. A person who lives that way doesn't suddenly become a cold-blooded killer." Sarah smiled. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you didn't just save my life that morning. I think you saved your own life too. You were living as Iron Patterson, the gunfighter, the man everyone feared. But when you stepped forward to save me, you became James Patterson again. The man with a heart big enough to risk everything for love." Iron considered this as they continued dancing. She was right. He had been living half a life before he met Sarah, defining himself by his reputation and his skills with a gun. Loving her had reminded him that he was capable of gentleness and sacrifice, and all the things that made life worth living. "So we saved each other," he said. "We saved each other," Sarah agreed. As the evening wound down and the townspeople began to head home, James and Sarah Patterson climbed into their wagon for the ride to their new ranch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new adventures, but they would face them together. The gallows that had been built for Sarah's execution had been taken down the day after Henderson's arrest. In its place, the town had built a small garden with a plaque that read, "In memory of those who seek truth and justice, and in celebration of those who find love." Sarah often brought her students to that garden for outdoor lessons. She would tell them the story of how important it was to look for truth even when everyone else believed a lie, and how love could give people the courage to do impossible things. And sometimes, when the children asked her about the man who had saved her life, she would smile and tell them that heroes didn't always look the way you expected them to. Sometimes they looked like schoolteachers or bank clerks or even former gunfighters who had found something worth living for. The most important thing, she would tell her students, is to never give up on truth, never give up on justice, and never give up on love. Because sometimes, when you least expect it, all three will come together to change your life forever. James would often join these outdoor lessons, sharing his own wisdom about courage and perseverance and the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult or dangerous. Together, James and Sarah Patterson became pillars of the Cedar Ridge community, respected not just for the dramatic story of how they met, but for the quiet heroism they showed in their daily lives. They raised 4 children who grew up hearing the story of their parents' courtship and who learned from it the value of courage, truth, and sacrificial love. Years later, when James was an old man with grey hair and Sarah was a grandmother with laugh lines around her eyes, they would sit on their porch in the evenings and talk about that morning when dawn had brought not death, but the beginning of their life together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward that day?" Sarah would ask. James would always give the same answer, "No, because I couldn't not step forward. Some things are bigger than fear, bigger than self-preservation. Love is one of those things." And Sarah would take his weathered hand in hers and think about how a single moment of courage had changed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone who heard their story and was inspired to believe that love really could conquer all. The story of James and Sarah Patterson became legend in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding towns. It was told and retold around campfires and dinner tables, in churches and schoolhouses, wherever people gathered who needed to be reminded that even in the darkest moments, hope and love and justice could still prevail. But for James and Sarah themselves, The most important part of their story wasn't the dramatic rescue or the romantic proposal or even the happy ending. The most important part was the quiet love they built together day by day, year by year, through all the ordinary moments that made up their extraordinary life together, because that's what real love is, they would tell anyone who asked. Not just the willingness to die for someone, but the commitment to live for them, to build something beautiful with them, to choose them again and again, year after year, until death finally parts you. And in Cedar Ridge, where justice had once nearly failed and love had triumphantly intervened, their story served as a permanent reminder that the most powerful force in the world isn't fear or hatred or even death itself. The most powerful force in the world is love that refuses to give up. At dawn, the Marshal called for her execution. A warrior stormed the crowd, roaring, "Hang me, not her!"